we'll go ahead and get started here. I hope everybody had a good time at the break and the book signing. I want to give Janice and the other conference organizers and those of you who have come a chance to give me to talk, a chance to give me the opportunity to talk about three things which I'm extremely passionate about. Naval history, Kanban, and how we think and organizations learn. So I'll spend some time talking about that. First, a little bit about me. I like to describe myself as an agile coach. I'm with a company called Explicit Consulting, which is just a couple miles down the road in Arlington. I've been doing software for a long time, close to about 25 years now. Started as a software engineer, and I'm very interested in how organizations think and learn. That thread also runs through my alternate career as a naval historian. Doing some of the math this morning, I realized that the first article I published in a referee journal happened about 15 years ago. So got a little more experience with software, but still have a fair amount of experience with naval history. And the thread that ties those two passions together is how organizations think and how organizations learn and how we build effective teams. So I want to talk a bit more about that. The topic today is distributed cognition. This is in some ways a response to a conversation a colleague of mine and I had about 6 months ago, where he was telling me that, well, you know, Kanban is just shared understanding. It's just making sure that we all know, you know, the same thing. And I think Kanban is something deeper than that, or at least has the potential to be something deeper than that. I think it can help us create a system that has greater cognitive capacity than the sum of the individuals that are participating in that system. And I suspect you're here to understand more about what that means and how we might go about doing it. Before we get too far into the details of that, though, I want to start with a little bit of a story, a historical example or historical problem. As I said, I'll be talking about naval history a little bit, and specifically, this was difficulty that the United States Navy had in understanding what was going on and commanding its forces in fast-paced, complex naval battles 75 years ago. 75 years ago, as you all know, is the heat of World War II. And last December was the 75th anniversary of the attack on Pearl Harbor. I was fortunate enough to speak at a symposium. We talked about the run-up to war in the Japanese and American navies and societies. That is another talk. But the things that are relevant here for us today, beyond the fact that Pearl Harbor is an extreme punctuation point. David has talked at length, and did again yesterday, about the value of punctuation points. And the United States leadership took the opportunity to put into place new naval commanders in the wake of the attack. That was important. I'll get a little bit more to that later. But before the war, the United States Navy had become very good at evolutionary improvement in terms of how it did what it did, particularly how it thought about and how it executed fighting. I see parallels with what we do in Kanban systems. They had developed an effective learning system, and they had embraced this idea, which has now become known as mission command. They used the term mission, they didn't use the term mission command. This has found its way into what we do. You've heard David use the term Einheit, Auftragstaktik. It's found its way into what we do through the work of Stephen Bungay and others who have looked back at the Prussian military system. Well, the United States naval leadership in the late 19th century, as most militaries did, looked back at the Prussian military system in the wake of the Franco-Prussian War and said, they've got something here. But they approached it from a uniquely American perspective. And unfortunately, Bungay and others like him have focused too much on what land armies were doing and not as much about what navies were doing. And that's led us to miss some of this important work. I've got the OODA loop down here, John Boyd's idea, because they were doing this. But before the introduction of the US Defense Department in 1947, American military leadership did not embrace acronyms the way they do now. So they didn't have a catchy name for it. So a lot of that work has been lost. But the important background for us is, they had this evolutionary approach to improvement, and they fostered leadership at multiple levels, and they learned. And that has important ramifications for the story. Now, that OODA loop, or at least that way of approaching how they did things, was particularly prevalent at the operational level. So we tend to think of the attack on Pearl Harbor as this devastating assault that threw at least the United States on its haunches for a little bit and allowed the Japanese to assure dominion over most of the Pacific. It allowed them to capture the Philippines and much of Southeast Asia. But very quickly, Admiral Chester Nimitz, the new commander-in-chief of the Pacific Fleet, acted aggressively to try to disrupt Japanese plans. There were a series of carrier raids. These started as early as January 1942 to try to disrupt Japanese plans and allow the Allies some breathing space. These raids were moderately successful. You've probably heard of the most famous one, the Doolittle raid, which actually bombed Tokyo. And then they led to some carrier battles in early 1942. The first of these is Coral Sea, where the Americans turned back the Japanese attempt to take Port Moresby in New Guinea. That was 75 years ago this month. And then the famous Battle of Midway in June. Midway gives Nimitz and the Allied commanders an opportunity. You can see the battles here, not very well probably, because this is a bit of an eye chart, but this is where they took place. Japanese plans were disrupted after Midway. The initiative hangs in the balance. Many commentators present the Battle of Midway as a turning point. It's not a turning point. It's the opportunity. It's another punctuation event to potentially seize the initiative. And this is what Nimitz tries to do. He invades in the Solomon Islands, a small island called Guadalcanal, where the Japanese are building an airfield. And the directive from the American Joint Chiefs is to begin an offensive thrust to try to capture or isolate the Japanese base in Rabaul, New Ireland. So the Marines and the Navy invade Guadalcanal. Eventually, later, the Army shows up. And this happens in August 1942. That is the island in the background here. This is the invasion fleet. The airfield was extremely important. The Marines, when they captured it, named it Henderson Field after one of their aviators who had been killed at the Battle of Midway. And this allowed the Allied forces to have some local dominance over the island, over the region. The Japanese tried to contest this. The base at Rabaul is very far away, but their long-range airplanes allow them to make periodic attacks. But it means that if they want to attack, if they want to land more surface forces, if they want to try to throw back the Allied advance, they have to do it at night. They come to Guadalcanal at night. This triggered 5 significant and important night surface battles. The situation at night is very different from during the day, as you can imagine. These are 3 US cruisers in formation. Oops, let me go back. And in the day, officers on board ships, captains, and their subordinates can make sense of what is going on. They can see the action developing around them, and they can understand what to do, and they can understand how to coordinate and act together. The situation at night is very different. The United States Navy had planned for and practiced night battles, but it turns out that it's far more confusing than they had anticipated. And you can get a little bit of a sense of why. This is a line of American cruisers. The one making the particularly big flash over here is cruiser Helena, which participated in a number of these battles and was later sunk. Helena had 15 guns along her major battery. Each of them could fire about every 6 seconds. She fired them continuously. So you get a sense there's about 90 of these flashes going off any given minute. if you're on board a ship where all that is happening, it can be very confusing and difficult to make sense of what is going on. Add to that rain squalls and smoke screens, other difficulty just understanding what is happening. And that's just one ship in a formation of from 10 to 15. A number of commentators have said, well, US naval commanders didn't really know what they were doing. They had radar. Radar helps you see at night. They could have understood all this. They could have made sense of it all. They had a tool. And you see here on the left is Battleship Washington. She has 4 different radars in this picture. On the right is Cruiser Chester. She has 2 different radars. Radars were used for different things. The uppermost one here is to search the air. This is a fire control radar for her main guns. This is a surface search radar to look for other ships. And this one is a fire control radar for her secondary batteries that would shoot at airplanes. The fire control radars work very well. All they have to do is provide radar ranges. Makes it very accurate to shoot the guns. These search radars are much more difficult to use because the operators using them are watching the screen. And they're watching a screen that looks kind of like this. This screen is also very difficult to make sense of. Here you can see a few blips. You might get a sense of what that is. These are different ships or contacts. This one's mostly just white space. Very confused. It is being interfered with by land masses. So it's difficult for the operator to understand what is going on. But even still, the operators would report what they observed. I have a contact. It is that far away. It's on this bearing. There's no sense of state. There's an immediate, this is the information. And that is the information that would come to the captain of the ship or the commander of the formation. And it is up to him to then begin to try to make sense of what's going on. So his visibility is obscured by the flashes of light, by the haze, and he's getting these intermittent reports from radar screens about what is going on. And captains very quickly became overwhelmed by all this information, and they lost track of the situation, and it became very difficult to coordinate between and among ships. Task forces would break down, and ships would fight individually as best they could. These same problems beset the Japanese, but the United States was particularly interested in trying to figure out how to get this better, how to coordinate multiple ships and task forces to operate as a cohesive unit. It's interesting because as part of the learning mechanisms that had been established, these ships would all fill out, to varying degrees of detail, an action report after a battle. Here's what happened, here's what we did, here's what we saw. And in collating and going through these reports, Admiral Nimitz and his staff back at Pearl Harbor realized, well, the information's all there. If we could make sense of this in real time, we could do much better. This has parallels, and I've seen a couple nods in the audience, to some of the situations that we face today with our teams, right? It can be very difficult to make sense of the complex knowledge work that we engage in, because the knowledge work is invisible, right? It's hidden from us. It's obscured like ships out there in the darkness. But we have to coordinate. We have to work together as a cohesive team to try to figure out how to progress it. And this is true of various different kinds of knowledge work, right? If we're building software, it's true if we're working on projects, it's true. What are we doing? We're adding information and knowledge to the work that we are progressing through. So it's not the lines of code that we're writing. It's not all the designs that we're putting together and presenting to people. It's the assumptions we're invalidating, and it's the value that we're delivering. So it can be very difficult to get your head around these things. And we often lose track of the work. In January, I started working with a new collection of teams. And one of them, a situation very much like this. They would stand up every morning and talk about what they were doing. Ostensibly, they were doing Kanban. They didn't have whip limits. And when they stood up every morning to talk, they wouldn't stand up around the board. So I would sit amongst them and hear what they were talking about. I'd stand up with them. Oh yeah, I'm working on this and I'm working on that. And And you could sort of individually, okay, that's the thing that you're doing, but I don't know how it relates to the thing that you're doing. And how are we all collaborating to deliver value? It's very difficult to get a sense of that. But just like the problem the Navy faced, the information's there. And just like with radar, right? Radar is a tool, gives you a certain level of visibility, but that's not the solution to just have that tool. Because this team that I was just talking about, they had Jira, work was in Jira. They didn't look at it while they were talking about what they were doing. So there's more to it. We have to find more things to do. So I think there's value in thinking about what the Navy did. And they created a system that changed the cognitive load within the ships and allowed them to begin to make sense of these challenging environments. And like in Kanban, the Navy encouraged leadership at multiple levels. So the first ad hoc approach to this was created on board this ship. This is Destroyer Fletcher, pictured in the Solomons in early 1943. And her captain was a guy named William Cole, and he had an executive officer, a guy named Joseph Wiley, who went on to think quite a bit about strategy. He's got a very good book on strategy that you can look up. And what they agreed to do was Wiley was going to stand sort of with 1 foot in the radar room and 1 foot on the bridge. He was going to wear different headphones so that he could communicate with different arms within the ship, one of which was Cole. He wanted to be able to communicate to Cole directly, and he would observe the radar screen and the radar operator and create a sense of what was going on. So he became sort of a state machine that managed the information coming from radars and other sources and could give Cole actionable intelligence about what to do. And that freed Cole up. Cole didn't have to understand what was going on. He just, Wiley, where's the next target? What course should we head? And then he could give the orders to the ship. And this allowed Fletcher to escape unscathed from 2 of the battles in late 1942 off of Guadalcanal. Almost simultaneously, Nimitz and his staff, culling through the information coming from the ships, realized that they needed to take a different tact. And I like this picture of Nimitz because he looks very human here. This is from early 1942, before these battles began, when the Japanese were running roughshod across the Pacific. And I think you can see a little bit of the haggard emotion on his face. But what they decided to do was to tell every ship, you need to create a thing, a system. You need to create something that we're going to call a Combat Information Center. We're not going to tell you how to do it, but here's what it needs to do. Keep track of all the information from all these various sources that we have. Radars, high-frequency radios, sighting reports, etc. Create plots. Plot the information so that it's not just where are these contacts right now, but how are they moving across the surface? How is this situation developing? Give all this information to an individual called the evaluator, the officer in charge of the Combat Information Center, and he becomes the one who provides it to the ship or the task force so that it can be acted upon. And all these ships began to experiment, and the most effective mechanisms were harnessed and then promulgated back out to the fleet. So as soon as Nimitz found out what Wiley was doing aboard Fletcher, he said, hey, that's great. Rather than taking you and putting you in command of another destroyer, why don't you come back to Pearl Harbor and train other guys? We'll all figure out how to do this. And that's what they did. So they developed this set of symbology that allowed them to track and make sense of the developing situation around them. Made the invisible visible. Created these new roles to plot the information from the radars, to understand what was going on, and this distributed the cognitive load, right? So the CIC becomes kind of a brain within the ship. And the fact that it's plotted and it's visualized, and that we've got an agreed upon symbology. Now, it took some period of time to agree on what the symbology was going to be. It took practically a year. But when it was in place, it allowed commanders and captains to rapidly make sense of the developing situation and act on it, right? So they take out of their head this need to keep track of everything that is going on in the world around them. It goes into these plots and any other mechanisms. And now captains can take that cognitive energy that they still have, because we're not going to just get rid of it, and use it to make quick, effective decisions and coordinate, because they know where the other ships in their formation are, and they know how to act together. And this had dramatic results. Fundamentally changed how these battles were fought. Because as the Allied forces moved up the Solomon chain, they continued to fight the Japanese. The Japanese adapted their tactics as well. They didn't adapt as fast. So what we have here, this is Commander Arleigh Burke. He was in charge of Destroyer Squadron 23. These are some of his captains. They fought a battle in November of 1943, very close to Rabaul, called the Battle of Cape St. George. And after the battle, these are some things that he said about how it worked. You know, we weren't confused. We all knew what was going on. It was better than a drill. And at the end, they got back together, and they took the different track charts, the different plots from the various ships, and they practically superimposed one over the other. They all had this shared sense of what was going on, right? And so none of Burke's ships were damaged in this battle. They sank 3 Japanese destroyers at the cost of nothing, because they were able to do this, because they had this cognitive capacity. And the president of the Naval War College at the time described this as perfect battle. So I want to drill a little bit more into this idea of distributed cognition and explain what it is. I mentioned that it's a system that has greater cognitive capabilities than the individuals within it. So I think that this is a nice sort of thought experiment to explain it. It's not mine. I have to credit it to John Searle, who thinks about how computers think, or how they can be made to think. And he calls it the Chinese room. I think because it's easy for the people that he teaches to understand this, because they don't have a working knowledge of Chinese. And the idea is basically that John or another person is in a room with no knowledge of Chinese, but with a book that, given certain questions in Chinese, it provides you with an available range of acceptable answers, also in Chinese. So what happens is that people who can speak Chinese write their questions on a sheet of paper, slip it under the door. John takes it, looks at it, looks for it in the book, finds an acceptable response, writes down the acceptable response, slips it back out under the door. So to someone interfacing with the system, it has knowledge of Chinese. But John doesn't have knowledge of Chinese. And the book doesn't have the capability to respond or engage. So it's a very simple, basic system that, with inputs, rules, and outputs, has this capability to speak Chinese. Now, what we want to develop are things much more sophisticated than that. But that's sort of the essence of what a distributed cognitive system is. A key piece of this is that the systems that we build, software systems or other systems, these are cultural systems, right? One of the things that's embedded within them is a whole set of rules, how we negotiate, deal with each other, address each other, how we do work. So many of these things are implicit. If we make them explicit, and we create these rules and symbols, then we can create a distributive cognitive system. And I think effective Kanban systems do this, right? They're not unlike the CIC. It has these various symbols and rules to help us understand the world around us. We get a lot of benefits out of this, right? It becomes much easier to make sense of the current situation. Our individual cognitive burden is lowered, so we free up capacity to think about other things. We create slack for ourselves in our own heads. Makes it faster and easier to self-organize because of that lower cognitive burden, and we can also effectively decentralize decision-making because we've gained alignment through these rules and these symbols that we've created. Essentially, we can get through this OODA loop faster. We can make it tighter, right? It's observe, orient, decide, act. It can be happening, every day or at higher levels every week, or however fast we want to make it appropriate for the different level that we're at. So how does this relate to Kanban? Right. Well, these are some of the LKU definitions for what Kanban is, and I think these are very good ones. Right? We want to improve service delivery, we want to catalyze improvements, and we want to become fit for purpose. There's that evolutionary idea, which I like very much. I think it's a good fit. And if we look at some of the practices, visualize. Right? Well, visualization is one of the key things that we want to be doing with our symbols to create a distributed cognitive system. We want to limit work in progress and manage flow, and we want to make policies explicit. Well, WIP limits are just a special kind of explicit policies. So here we have it. Wow, we've got rules and we've got symbols. We've got the potential for a distributed cognitive system. And feedback loops and collaborative improvement through experimentation are ways to just make all this better. Right? So not only can we create a distributed cognitive system, we can continually refine it. And we can use it to make sense of the complex and challenging knowledge work that we have. Or, if we're thinking about pulling and bringing new work into the system, one of the things that we aim for is the ability to very quickly and easily make the best choice for the current situation. And I've got a great example of this. This is one of my favorites. So, my wife is Jewish, and she likes to host a Seder in the springtime. And how cooking is one way that she expresses love for her family and friends. And it's great, and I want to help. And so years ago when we used to do this, I'd get into the kitchen, and I'd do the thing that she told me to do, then I'd say, okay, what do I do next? Do that thing, wash the potatoes. Okay, wash the potatoes. What do I do next? And usually that second question time was about where, and I see some other nods in the room, there she would just go, I'll just do it, because it's faster for me to just do it than it is to explain it to you while I'm trying to do all these other things. So after a while I thought, well, hey, how about we write down all the things we want to do? Because we know it's a dinner. We kind of know the different things that we want to do. Let's write those things down. Let's put them on Post-its. Let's put them up there. And let's create a to-do, doing, done. Hey, let's get ourselves a little simple proto-Kanban around this stuff. And this was amazing. If you ever want to try something similar, I would highly recommend it, because it took all this knowledge that was in her head and put it here. And so when I got done with something, I wouldn't have to bother her. I could just look up and go, what am I going to do next? Oh, I'm going to do that. Boom. And off we go. And these are the kinds of things that we embedded on the Post-its, right? Well, the brisket is kind of the centerpiece of the meal. So you got to cook it. It's got to be in the oven for a long time. So this is when we want it done. That's about when we have to start it. And some additional information on there. Timing was a huge piece of this because we're trying to get everything done at about the same time. And you can see how this kind of evolved. We've got artifacts here because we kind of wrote the duration first, and then we figured out, oh, they all need to finish at the same time. Maybe that should be on the ticket as well. And yeah, we could do simple math to the start time. And so these were the kinds of things that I used to figure out, well, what should I be doing next? So the great thing about this was then we could focus on doing the things, because information about what to do and when we had embedded in our symbology, and it was great. Things flowed. We had a great time in the kitchen. Everything was ready on time. It was wonderful. In Kanban, we do some similar things in a more sophisticated Kanban system. Right? One of the things that we want to do is create a pull system that tells us what to do and when to do it. Right? So we get ourselves our WIP limits, which create the virtual Kanban pull signals. We put our policies on here, and we move work across. All right? And so we know when we can pull something. This is relatively simple. But we get a shared sense of when work is pullable and what criteria it has to meet to move across. I suspect most of you know this, but it builds on itself, right? As we move these things across, now we can begin to embed more information into the system. We can make it smarter. We can take some of this information, some of these policies out of our head and put them in the system, right? So we can create classes of service, which become new rules or explicit policies around how we're going to handle the work. And we can treat it differently or handle it differently based on a variety of different variables. These are just some that are common. And these are the 4 types that are typical. If you played the Kanban game, you are familiar with these. I've made the expedite red instead of white just so that it stands out against the slides. And, you know, in the Seder, we had more sort of a fixed time. So each one of these had a certain cost of delay associated with it. It's very easy to do the math and figure out, well, what should I be doing now? You can do a similar thing in the system, right? So here, we're moving the expedite across. It doesn't count against the WIP limit, so we've got an extra slot in here now. Expedite's really important. Let's move it, right? So you can see how this adds a lot more fidelity, a lot more information to the prior Kanban visualization, which was just a whole bunch of blue tickets, right? Then they're all the same. It doesn't really matter what we pull. Now, we've got different classes of service. Now it matters. So we're going to pull that expedite across pretty quickly. That one's done. We have space for it, so let's move it. And now we're going to concentrate on some of these fixed dates because they have to be ready by a certain time, so we're going to move these across the board. All right? And we've embedded more knowledge here in the system. We can get more sophisticated yet, right? We can create this capacity allocation arrangements. So we can handle risk differently in the system. Sometimes this is tied to classes of service. What I really like about this is it becomes a decision framework, or maybe more viscerally, what Todd Little was talking about at the first of the lightning talks yesterday, right? The difference between a bucket and a filter. This is a way to begin to filter. Right? So suppose we create these different capacity allocations. We want these numbers of these types of classes of service in our system at any given time. And the work moves across. And what I like about this is we can get ourselves to the point where we are figuring out what to do next. Right. So we've got 4 open slots in the ready. And now we need to figure out what we're going to put in there next. What are we going to pull? We've got these rules around the different classes of service. Well, we've got 2 fixed date that we could pull. We've got 3 in the system already. So maybe we should pull one of those. We want to have 3 intangible in the system. We've only got 2. Well, so maybe we should pull that one. And that gives us 2 slots left, so maybe we pull the 2 standard ones. But we want to have 8 standards, so 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Maybe we should pull 3 standard ones and the intangible. Or maybe we should pull 3 standard ones and a fixed date. But the nice thing here is we filtered this, right? So now we can have intelligent conversations around, well, do we do this fixed date or this fixed date? And do we do 3 standards and no intangible, or do we do the intangible instead of 2 standards? Or maybe we pull in both fixed dates because that's the right thing to do right now, even though our capacity allocation would suggest it's not. So by adding this filtering capability, by embedding within our system a level of cognition, we can use our brains instead of figuring out what to pull from the backlog based on a beauty contest. We can pull based on intelligence and our awareness of the current situation. All right? So this becomes very powerful. And I think that's one of the aspects that we tend to underemphasize when we talk about the power of Kanban. We've been in there, we've viscerally experienced it, we like it, we enjoy it, we bring it to our colleagues and our clients. But sometimes I think we don't argue strongly enough for how it can impact our decision making and our mental choices. So to sum up, I think this is a real thing. I think it exists in a variety of different circumstances and situations. And I think the US Navy's Combat Information Center is one of them. And I think it gives you a whole slew of benefits. You can make decisions faster. You can self-organize more effectively because you've got this shared context, because you've offloaded some of the cognition, can help mitigate risk. And the keys to doing it are having an effective visualization, right? Get symbols that make sense for your context and have policies or rules that align with the strategies, the filters, or the other things that you want to be able to enable and create. So I think you can do this. I think you can tighten your OODA loop with it. You can make better decisions. I think you can continually improve your fitness. It's a great way to get along with it. If you are not terribly familiar with some of the things that I just talked about, then Kanban training, the Kanban systems design, or KMP1 class is a great way to get started. I'm a trainer. I can help you with that. Lots of people here with the weight lanyards. Oh, I took mine off. Can help you with that as well. So thank you, and I believe we have a few minutes for questions.